Somewhere beneath the sand at Brighton Beach, on the southern shore of Port Phillip Bay, there is a slab of bluestone the size of a man's hand. Carved into its face in crude capital letters are the initials MN, and beneath them a date, 22/10/94. The stone has been there since the 1930s, when Depression-era work crews dismantled the crumbling walls of the old Melbourne gaol and carted the blocks down to the coast to build a seawall. Most of the stones were slotted in anonymously, just rubble against the tide. But some of them were not rubble at all. Some of them had once stood at the head of graves inside the jail, graves dug in haste and filled with quicklime, graves that belonged to the men and women who had been hanged from the beam upstairs. The initials MN belonged to one of those women. Her name was Martha Needle. In the final decade of the 19th century, in the inner Melbourne suburb of Richmond, she poisoned her husband. She poisoned her 3 daughters. She poisoned the brother of the man she hoped to marry next. She did it slowly, patiently, cup by cup, spoonful by spoonful, with a product called Rough on Rats that cost a few pennies at the grocer's shop across the road from her own front door. When the bodies were finally exhumed, pulled from the earth in South Australia and Victoria alike, the government analyst found arsenic saturating their remains. In one body alone, 34 grains of poison. 2 grains were enough to kill. She was 31 years old when she was hanged. She weighed 50 kilograms. Her last words when the sheriff asked if she had anything to say were, "No, sir, I have nothing to say." This is the story of a woman who came from nothing, married into violence, buried her entire family, and was buried in turn beneath quicklime and stone. A stone that ended up wedged into a seawall on a beach where joggers now pass with their dogs, and their oat milk lats, utterly unaware they are walking over a ghost sign from one of the darkest chapters in Australian criminal history. It is a story about arsenic and insurance, about colonial poverty and colonial silence, about the terrible ease with which a woman could kill in an age when no one was watching. And it is a story about what happens when the dead refuse to keep their secrets. Martha Charles was born on the 9th of April, 1863, on the banks of the Murray River near the small settlement of Morgan in South Australia. The colony was barely 3 decades old. Morgan itself was a dusty waypoint on the river trade route, a place where paddle steamers docked to offload wool and wheat, and where families clung to the fringes of settlement life with whatever grip they could manage. Martha's parents, Joseph Henry Charles and Mary Newland, had already separated before she was born. Joseph had threatened Mary and had once been accused of attempting to poison her, a grim foreshadowing that would not become apparent for another 30 years. He disappeared from the record not long after Martha's birth and is believed to have died when she was very young. Mary remarried in 1870, taking as her second husband a man named Daniel Foran, a former soldier with the 2nd Somersetshire Regiment of Foot, an Irishman from Caherconlish in County Limerick. Foran had deserted the army 3 times and bore the punishment for it. The letter D tattooed beneath each arm, branded into his skin by military instruments in the manner prescribed before 1871. He was a drunkard and a brute, and the household he and Mary kept was one of relentless deprivation. Police reports later described Mary as addicted to drink, with many convictions for drunkenness, indecent language, and willful damage. The family lived in a small 2-room house in North Adelaide, and the children suffered accordingly. Martha's suffering went beyond poverty. Neighbors testified that her mother beat her regularly, with sticks, with rope, with whatever was at hand. And in December 1875, when Martha was 12, Daniel Foran sexually assaulted her. He was charged, tried before Justice Stowe, found guilty by a jury after 30 minutes of deliberation, and sentenced to the maximum term allowed by law, 2 years hard labor, 2 years, for the ruin of a child. Martha left home at 13. She went into domestic service, working as a housekeeper in Port Adelaide. She was, by all later accounts, an attractive girl who grew into a strikingly handsome woman, dark-haired, well-dressed, quick to smile. She had survived a childhood that would have broken many, and she emerged from it with something that looked, from the outside, like resilience. Whether that appearance was the whole truth is a question that would haunt everyone who ever tried to understand what came next. In 1882, at the age of 18, Martha Charles married Henry Needle. Henry was an Englishman, born in 1860 in Weedon, Northamptonshire, a village in the Midlands known for its military depot and its quiet green countryside. He was the son of Thomas Wilson Needle and Hannah Margaret Brain, and he had emigrated to Australia with his family aboard the ship Forfarshire. Arriving with his parents and 4 siblings, he became a carpenter. He was older than Martha, steady in his work, and at first kind to her. The marriage appeared happy. A daughter, Mabel, was born in 1882. Elsie followed in 1883 and May in 1885 or 1886. The young family moved from South Australia to the Melbourne suburb of Richmond, drawn by the promise of work and the expanding economy of Victoria's capital. They settled in Cubitt Street, and their neighbors regarded them as a well-matched, comfortably situated couple. Martha kept a tidy house. Henry brought home a carpenter's wage. For a few years, it seemed as though Martha had built the life she had been denied as a child. But the cracks appeared quickly. Martha was sociable, outgoing and attractive. She enjoyed the company of men. Henry, by contrast, was shy, jealous, and prone to dark moods. The jealousy curdled into violence. Henry began beating Martha, at times with slabs of wood, according to later testimony. Here again was the pattern of Martha's life. The man who was supposed to protect her became the man who hurt her. She had escaped one brutal household only to find herself trapped in another, this time with 3 small daughters in tow and nowhere else to go. The colonial world offered women like Martha very few exits. Divorce was ruinously expensive and socially catastrophic. A woman's property, her earnings, even her children, were in many respects still subject to her husband's control. Shelters for abused women did not exist. The law, the church, and the community all conspired, sometimes through indifference, sometimes through design, to keep women in the homes they occupied, regardless of what happened inside them. Martha Needle was poor, uneducated, the product of an abusive childhood, married to a violent man, and responsible for 3 small lives. She had no resources, no allies, and no visible way out. What she did have, as it turned out, was access to poison. On the 23rd February 1885, 3-year-old Mabel Needle died. The cause was attributed to a cerebral tumor or an infectious disease. Accounts differ, but the doctor was not suspicious. Mabel had been violently sick and unable to eat. She seemed to fade, Martha told him, and the explanation was accepted. Childhood mortality in colonial Australia was staggeringly high. Infections, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and 100 other hazards carried off children with grim regularity. Another dead toddler in Richmond barely warranted a raised eyebrow. What did warrant notice, though only in retrospect, was the insurance. Martha collected £100 on Mabel's death. In 1885, £100 was a substantial sum, equivalent to many months of a working man's wages. The money came from a policy taken out through one of the lodges of the Independent Order of Oddfellows, of which Henry Needle was a member. The policy covered the entire family. After Mabel's death, Henry Needle seems to have unraveled. He could not find work locally and traveled to Sydney, where he stayed for several months. In his absence, Martha's behavior changed. She began going out alone at night. Neighbors noted what they described as a flighty disposition, fond of company, and with a weakness for the admiration of the sterner sex. Whether this was simple socializing or something more, the gossip circuit of Richmond took note. Henry returned. The relationship deteriorated further. Then, in 1889, Henry himself fell gravely ill. He had been a robust man, but now he was racked by acute vomiting, fever, and an inability to keep food down. His doctor, George Hodgson, attended him and was puzzled by one curious detail. Henry refused to eat the chicken broth and jelly that Martha prepared for him. He would wave her offerings away, or in moments of anger, dash them against the wall. The doctor attributed this to irritability and obstinacy. No one asked the question that now seems obvious. Was Henry Needle afraid of his wife's cooking? Henry Needle died on the 4th of October 1889. The official cause of death was listed as subacute hepatitis, persistent vomiting, enteric fever, and exhaustion, due to obstinacy in not taking nourishment. No post-mortem was performed. No suspicion attached to Martha, who had appeared to give him devoted care. She collected £200 in life insurance. About a year after Henry's death, 6-year-old Elsie began to fall ill. Her doctor, Hodgson again, recalled vaguely that she may have been suffering from measles. He remembered the vomiting. He remembered with much greater clarity the child's mother. Martha had never appeared inattentive or unkind, he testified later. She had never obstructed his attendance. She had seemed, in every respect, like a devoted and grief-stricken parent. Elsie suffered for nearly 2 months before she died on the 9th of December 1890. Otto Juncken, who by then had entered Martha's orbit, would later testify about Martha's behavior during Elsie's illness. When Elsie was ill, I visited frequently. The prisoner's manner towards the child could not have been more kind and attentive. When Elsie died, I saw the accused the same night. She was greatly distressed over it. Martha collected another £60 in insurance, Elsie's share of the family policy. Only 7 months later, 4-year-old May's health began to deteriorate. The previously healthy child developed peculiar symptoms: constant vomiting, wasting, the same grinding decline that had taken her siblings and her father. May's doctor was troubled. The case attracted my attention particularly, he later admitted. I was always puzzled by the case. I could not arrive at a diagnosis satisfactory to myself. But Martha's care of her daughter was once again praised, not questioned. Mrs. Needle's conduct towards May could not have been more kind than it was, Otto Juncken testified. She seemed to have all a motherly love and affection for her. May Needle died on the 27th of August 1891, 1 month shy of her 5th birthday. The death certificate listed tubercular meningitis. Martha received the balance of the insurance money, another £80. She had now buried her husband and all 3 of her children in the space of 6 years. She had collected the entirety of the family's insurance, and not a single doctor, neighbor, policeman, or friend had suspected her of anything other than terrible luck. With the insurance money, Martha did something that observers found both touching and peculiar. She spent almost all of it on an elaborate grave for her family at the Boroondara General Cemetery in Kew, and she visited it almost every day. She placed a notice in the Age newspaper, a poem. I had 3 little treasures once. They were my joy and pride, but one by one they all have gone. They all have early drooped and died. All is dark within my dwelling. Lonely is my heart today, now unheard, unpitied, unrelieved. I must bear alone my load of care, inserted by their loving mother. If this story has already set your nerves on edge, consider what the neighbors of Richmond would have thought if they had known the truth. They saw a grieving mother visiting a beautiful grave. They saw devotion, heartbreak, and quiet resilience. They did not see what was in the tea. If you are following this series and want to keep up with every episode of the Crimson Files as it drops, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We are only getting deeper into the archive. In January 1892, Martha Needle moved to 137 Bridge Road, Richmond. The building was both a residence and a business premises, a saddlery operated by brothers Louis and Otto Juncken, who had come to Melbourne from Lyndoch in the Barossa Valley of South Australia. Their father was a German-born cabinet maker, and the brothers had grown up in the colonial rural tradition of hard work and practical skill. Louis ran the saddlery on the ground floor. The upper floors could accommodate lodgers. Martha became the housekeeper and began renting rooms as a small boarding house. She also began a relationship with Otto Juncken. Otto was younger than Louis, more romantic in temperament, and utterly bewitched by the handsome widow with her sad story and her immaculate grooming. Love letters passed between them. By April 1892, they were engaged. Louis was not charmed. He was the more perceptive of the brothers, and he had seen things that troubled him. Martha was subject to episodes, periods of blankness, rigidity, unresponsiveness. On at least one occasion, she went out at night to search for her dead children. Murmuring to herself in the dark streets, she displayed what witnesses described as frightful outbursts of temper. Lewis had also heard from his mother in South Australia, who had written to express her opposition to the marriage on the grounds of Martha's poor health and erratic behavior. Louis forbade the engagement. He told Otto that he could not marry a woman who exhibited such instability. This placed Martha in a position that was, from her perspective, existentially threatening. She had no husband, no children, no family, and no independent means of support. Otto was her lifeline. Louis was the obstacle. In August 1893, Louis fell ill. He suffered from violent vomiting, a sore mouth and gums, a swollen tongue. Martha attended him. She prepared his food and administered his medicine. Louis was sick for 10 or 13 days, but recovered. Something had changed, though. He consented to the engagement. Martha had, it seems, won. But Louis fell ill again in April 1894 with the same symptoms. A relative came to Adelaide to care for him, and he improved quickly. When the relative left on the 10th of May, Martha walked to a local shop that evening and purchased a box of Rough on Rats. The following morning, she prepared breakfast. Louis was seized again by the violent vomiting. He died on the 15th of May 1894. His doctor, McColl, certified the cause of death as exhaustion and inflammation of the stomach and membranes of the heart. There was no post-mortem. To understand how Martha Needle could kill 5 people over 9 years without arousing suspicion, you must understand the world she lived in. The 19th century has been called the arsenic century, and the name is not hyperbole. Arsenic was everywhere, in wallpaper, in fabric dyes, in cosmetics, in medicines, in candles, in food coloring, in children's toys. The vivid greens that the Victorians loved, in their parlor walls, their dresses, their artificial flowers, were frequently made with copper acetoarsenite, a compound so toxic that it slowly poisoned anyone who lived near it. The substance was cheap, widely available, and in its white powdered form, virtually undetectable in food or drink. Rat poison was the most common vehicle. The product Martha used was called Rough on Rats, manufactured by the E.S. Wells Company of Jersey City, New Jersey, and sold throughout the English-speaking world. Its primary active ingredient was arsenic trioxide, colored black with charcoal to distinguish it from flour or sugar. The advertisements were jaunty, clears out rats, mice, roaches, flies, ants, bed bugs, and the product was sold without restriction at any grocer's shop or chemist's counter. You did not need to sign a register, provide identification, or explain your purpose. You simply asked, paid your pennies, and walked out with enough poison to kill a household. In Martha's case, the grocer's shop was directly across the road from her residence. The Toole brothers operated at 124 Bridge Road, Richmond. Martha was a regular customer. No one thought twice about a woman buying rat poison. Every house had rats. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning, vomiting, stomach cramps, diarrhea, exhaustion, wasting were virtually indistinguishable from a dozen common diseases: typhoid fever, gastric fever, cholera, dysentery, meningitis. In an era before reliable blood tests and routine post-mortems, a doctor confronted with a vomiting patient in a working-class suburb had little reason and fewer resources to suspect poisoning. The diagnoses written on the death certificates of Henry Needle, Mabel, Elsie May, and Louis Juncken were all medically plausible. They were also all wrong. After Louis's death, Otto Juncken traveled to South Australia for the funeral and remained there with his family for some time. Martha was furious at his absence and wrote him a letter whose contents, when later published in the Argus, revealed the intensity and volatility of her attachment. In one passage, she threatened to walk every step to Linduk to kill Otto's mother if she continued to oppose the marriage. Eventually, the Juncken family dispatched another brother, Herman, to Melbourne. His mission was twofold: settle Louis's business affairs and persuade Otto to break off the engagement. Herman arrived, moved into the Bridge Road house, and immediately made it known that the family opposed the marriage. Within days, Herman fell violently ill. He ate a meal prepared by Martha and was seized by stomach cramps. He recovered, then fell ill again the next day after breakfast. 2 days later, still unwell, he ate a lunch Martha had prepared and collapsed once more. The same agonizing pattern of vomiting and pain. Something this time was different. Herman declined Martha's offer to nurse him. He went to stay with friends instead, and they urged him to see a doctor. The doctor who treated Herman was named Boyd, and Boyd was sharper than the general run of his colleagues. He recognized the symptoms not as typhoid but as irritant poisoning. He took a sample of Herman's vomit and sent it to the government laboratory for analysis. The analyst, C.R. Blackett, reported back with a finding that changed everything. The sample contained arsenic, colored by charcoal, consistent with the composition of Rough on Rats. Dr. Boyd went to the police. A trap was set. The detectives asked Herman to return to 137 Bridge Road and ask Martha to make him lunch. Herman sat down at the table. Martha prepared a cup of tea and placed it before him. Herman lifted it to his lips, tasted it, and detected the telltale bitterness. He put the cup down and blew a whistle. Detectives rushed into the room. Martha lunged for the teacup, struggling with Herman to overturn it and spill the evidence. A detective made a diving grab for the cup and saved its contents. When the government laboratory tested the tea, they found it contained 10 grains of arsenic. It was enough, the analyst reported, to kill 5 people. A box of rough on rats was found in Martha's cupboard. She was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of Herman Juncken. The poison had finally been caught in the cup. But what was hiding in the graves? If you are watching on YouTube, drop a comment below and tell us. Do you think Martha Needle was a cold, calculating killer, or a desperately ill woman whose suffering drove her to unspeakable acts? The answer may not be as simple as it seems. Like and share this episode to help us grow, and stay with us. The exhumations are next. With Martha in custody, the police acknowledged the devastating similarities between Herman's poisoning and the deaths that had preceded it. They applied for warrants to exhume the bodies of Louis Juncken, Henry Needle, and the 3 children. Lewis's body was retrieved from the cemetery at Lyndoch in South Australia. Detectives Whitney and Fryer supervised the disinterment and sent samples to Melbourne. The findings were staggering. 34 grains of arsenic were recovered from Lewis's remains. 2 grains constituted a fatal dose. The bodies of Henry Needle, Elsie, and May were exhumed from the Boroondara General Cemetery in Kew. The same elaborate grave Martha had purchased with the insurance money. The same grave she had visited nearly every day. The same resting place commemorated by her published poem. All 3 bodies contained arsenic. May's remains were more decomposed, but traces were still detectable. Only Mabel, buried separately years earlier, escaped analysis, but Elsie's body yielded what was described as an infinitesimal portion of arsenic, while Henry's and Lewis's showed massive contamination. Arsenic is a remarkable preservative, unlike many other poisons. It binds to keratin and calcium in the body, accumulating in hair, nails, and bone. Bodies saturated with arsenic decompose far more slowly than normal. In some cases, though not consistently documented in the Needle exhumations, specifically, arsenic-laced remains have been found with a characteristic green discoloration of the bones and tissues, a spectral tinting caused by the interaction of the metal with biological material. This property is what made arsenic the forensic investigator's paradox. The very substance used to kill also acted as an inadvertent preservative, holding the evidence of murder intact for years, even decades after the crime. The dead, in effect, were keeping the receipts. The analyst confirmed that the arsenic found in the bodies was consistent with the charcoal-colored composition of rough on rats. Martha Needle was charged with the murder of Louis Juncken. The trial of Martha Needle opened in September 1894 before Mr. Justice Hodges at the Criminal Court in Melbourne. She was charged with a single count of murder, the murder of Louis Juncken on the 15th of May 1894, though the evidence concerning her husband and children was presented extensively and, in the opinion of later legal commentators, prejudicially. In an era long before suppression orders or sub judice restrictions on press coverage, every detail of the exhumations, the arsenic levels, the insurance payouts, and Martha's personal life had been splashed across the newspapers of Victoria and beyond. The New York Times reported on the case. Melburnians queued to see a wax impression of the murderess at Kreitmeyer's museum. The trial was, in every sense, a public spectacle. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Martha had purchased rough on rats. She had prepared the meals and drinks consumed by every victim. The victims all died of arsenic poisoning, and she had been caught in the act of poisoning Herman Juncken. The cumulative weight of the evidence was devastating. Martha's defense counsel attempted to argue insanity. He pointed to her traumatic childhood, her history of sexual abuse, the fits and fainting spells that witnesses had described, the episodes of rigidity and unresponsiveness, the nocturnal wandering in search of dead children. Otto Juncken himself testified about her fits, sudden collapses without warning, periods of complete unconsciousness. The defense suggested that Martha was not responsible for her actions. Doctors called as expert witnesses were reluctant to commit themselves. Justice Hodges was not sympathetic. He dismissed the insanity plea with a remark that echoed through the courtroom and into the legal record. The law cannot wait while philosophers, physicians, and scientists settle metaphysical problems. Justice must be swift and sure. The jury retired for 40 minutes. They returned with a verdict of guilty. They made no recommendation of mercy. The prisoner received the death sentence with extraordinary calmness. She walked out of the dock unassisted, with a firm step and an unblanched face. Martha Needle was sentenced to death by hanging. In the weeks between sentencing and execution, Martha Needle was held in the condemned cell at Melbourne Gaol. She received regular visits from friends, from Otto, who continued to believe in her innocence, or at least in her incapacity, and from two spiritual advisors, the Reverend H.F. Scott, the Church of England chaplain, and a woman from the Salvation Army named Mrs. Hutchinson. None of them could read her. A contemporary newspaper account captured the bewilderment. None of those who are thrown into contact with Martha Needle can fathom her character. The condemned woman's mask of impenetrable reserve has confessedly baffled the governor of the jail, Dr. Shields, the government medical officer, and both her spiritual advisors. Even to these experienced eyes, the extraordinary woman is as inscrutable as the Sphinx. Martha made no confession. She stated repeatedly and without variation that she was entirely innocent. She expressed no remorse. She exhibited none of the religious fervor that had marked other condemned prisoners. Neither the frantic penitence of Francis Knorr, the baby farmer hanged earlier that same year, nor the theatrical contrition that the public expected from a woman about to meet her God. She was calm, composed, and unreadable. She read her Bible, her prayer book, and her hymn book. She said she preferred death. She expressed the conviction that she would go to heaven. 5 days before her execution, she dictated her will. It was witnessed by the sub-matron of the jail and a law clerk. The entirety of her estate, valued at £25, payable under a life insurance policy on herself from the Citizens Life Assurance Company, was left to Otto Juncken, whom she appointed sole executor. On the night before her death, she wrote Otto a final letter. It is a document that has been quoted many times, but its strange tenderness, its absolute refusal to acknowledge what she had done, remains unsettling more than a century later. My darling, as you wished me to write, I will do so, but truly I do not know what to say to you on this my last morning on earth. In a few hours I shall be free from all sorrow, but you, dear Otto, must live on for a time. Rest assured we shall meet again where there is no parting. Your good father, also poor Louis, and my dear little ones will welcome you. Elsie and May loved you on earth. They will do so in heaven. I must now say goodbye to you for a time. When you receive this, you can think of me as being in a happy home with my loved ones, waiting and watching for you. She addressed this letter to the man whose brother she had murdered, speaking of her dead children, the children she had killed, as though they were waiting for her in paradise. Martha Needle was executed at 8 o'clock on the morning of the 22nd of October 1894 at the old Melbourne Gaol. She was the third of 4 women to be hanged there. The others were Elizabeth Scott in 1863, Francis Knorr earlier in 1894, and Emma Williams in 1895. The details of the execution were recorded by Dr. Samantha Battams, who spent years in the archives uncovering them. Martha weighed just 50 kilograms. She was dressed in a plain brown dress that had been weighted with lead to prevent it ballooning upward as she dropped through the trapdoor. The dress was fixed with a cord. A white death cap was placed over her head to conceal her face and spare the witnesses from what one official called the hideousness of the event. The hangman strapped her hands. She was led to the top of the scaffold. The sheriff asked if she had any last words. "No, sir," she replied, "I have nothing to say." The bolt was drawn. The trapdoor opened. Martha Needle fell 8 feet to her death. The execution was later described as efficient, with death occurring instantaneously. At sunset, her body was buried in a grave of quicklime within the jail grounds. A small bluestone block was placed at the head of the grave, carved with her initials and the date, 22/10/94. The old Melbourne Gaol closed as a prison in 1924. When the bodies of executed prisoners were exhumed in 1929 for reinterment at Pentridge Prison, The bluestone grave markers proved their worth, allowing authorities to identify who lay in each crude coffin. Newspaper reports from the time described the morbid scene. A group of boys gathered to watch the digging, and one was seen leaving with a portion of a skull in his pocket. Among the bodies moved that day was Ned Kelly's. His grave, marked EK, is believed to have been identified using the same system of bluestone initials. Kelly's fame may, in fact, be the reason the markers existed at all. No evidence of any grave markers predating his 1880 burial has been found, and historians at Heritage Victoria believe the practice began because of him. When the jail's outer walls were demolished in the 1930s, the bluestone blocks, including the grave markers, were carted south to Brighton Beach to be incorporated into a new seawall. It was a Depression-era public works project, designed to protect the coast from erosion and to provide employment. The blocks were laid carefully. The grave markers were not defaced or inverted. Archaeologists who later examined the wall believe this suggests that the work crews knew what they were handling and made some effort at preservation. Martha Needle's headstone ended up in the Green Point section of the wall near Wellington Street. Unlike most of the other markers, which were placed with their inscriptions facing inward, hers was faced outward, the initials MN, and the date visible to anyone who walked past. Over time, sand drifts buried it. It lay hidden for decades until its precise location was rediscovered and confirmed. Today it sits beneath roughly a meter of sand on a beach where families picnic and dogs paddle in the shallows of Port Phillip Bay. Otto Juncken never wavered. Throughout the trial, the imprisonment and the execution, he maintained that Martha did not know what she was doing. She didn't know what she was doing, he told anyone who would listen. Whether this was love, denial, or some private understanding of Martha's fractured mind, he carried it with him for the rest of his life. In 1901, Otto married Bertha Abrecht and moved to Hawthorne. They had 6 children. Otto anglicized the family name from Juncken to Juncken in 1924 and, in partnership with a Danish-born builder named Lauritz Hansen, founded what would become one of Australia's most prominent construction firms. Hansen Juncken built the National Bank headquarters on Collins Street, the Port Authority building, the Sun Theatre in Yarraville, the Collingwood Football Club grandstand at Victoria Park, the Meyer Emporium on Bourke Street, and dozens of other landmarks. In 1929, Otto devised an ingenious suspended scaffold system to replaster the domed ceiling of the State Library of Victoria, a system that allowed workers to dangle above the reading room like human chandeliers, completing work that would otherwise have required the closure of the building. Otto Juncken died in 1945, half a century after Martha's execution. The firm he co-founded is still operating, led by the 6th generation of the Hansen family. Some of Melbourne's most iconic buildings bear his fingerprints. He built an empire from the ashes of a catastrophe, and he did it while carrying the memory of a woman who had murdered his brother and, in all probability, would have murdered him too had she been given the chance. Martha Needle's story did not end with her death. It rippled forward through the generations. On the 15th of July 1920, 26 years after Martha's hanging, a man named Alexander Newland Lee was executed at the Adelaide Gaol. He was 31 years old. He had poisoned his wife, Muriel, and 3 of his 7 children with strychnine. Alexander Lee was the son of Martha's older sister Ellen. The parallels are extraordinary. Aunt and nephew, both 31 at death, both poisoners, both convicted of killing a spouse and children, both hanged. The crimes were separated by a quarter of a century, but followed the same terrible pattern. Domestic murder by poison, the methodical elimination of family, the final reckoning on the scaffold. Dr. Samantha Badams, who authored The Secret Art of Poisoning, The True Crimes of Martha Needle, has asked the question that no one can fully answer. What strange quirk of fate led these 2 relatives to commit virtually the same crime? Badams has explored the possibility that the answer lies not only in circumstance but in the intergenerational transmission of trauma. The idea, supported by emerging research in epigenetics, that the experiences of one generation can leave biological and psychological marks on those that follow. Martha's family was shattered by violence, alcoholism, sexual abuse, and poverty. Her sister Ellen's family was no different. The soil from which both Martha and Alexander grew was poisoned long before either of them reached for the powder. You have now heard the full story of Martha Needle. From the banks of the Murray River to the scaffold at Melbourne Gaol, from a bluestone cell to a bluestone seawall. If this episode moved you, angered you, or made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Tell us which case you want us to investigate next. And if you have not yet subscribed to the Crimson Files, now is the time. The archive is deep, and we are not done digging. The question that haunts every account of Martha Needle is the question of motive. She collected insurance money, roughly £500 in total, but she spent most of it on a grave and a headstone. She did not live lavishly. She did not flee. The money does not by itself explain why a woman would kill her own children. Dr. Badams has argued that Martha was suffering from a dissociative disorder and possibly Munchausen syndrome by proxy, gaining attention and sympathy through the illnesses and deaths of her dependents. Witnesses consistently described her as the most loving, nurturing mother they had ever seen. She was attentive, kind, and apparently grief-stricken at every death. She drew Otto Juncken closer by playing on the tragedy of her sick children. She was, in Badams's analysis, getting recognition from people through caring for others. Others have pointed to Martha's psychiatric instability, the fits, the hallucinations, the fugue states, the volatile temper, the history of childhood trauma and sexual abuse, the reported addiction to patent medicines containing laudanum, morphine hydrochloride, cannabis, and chloroform. All of it paints a picture of a woman who was profoundly unwell in ways that her society had neither the language nor the inclination to address. The all-male jury that convicted her did not hear expert psychiatric testimony of the kind that would be standard in a modern courtroom. Justice Hodges's dismissal of the insanity defense was swift and categorical, and yet the planning was meticulous. The poison was purchased deliberately. The doses were calibrated to produce slow, plausible illness rather than sudden death. The insurance was collected methodically. The trap set for Herman was only sprung because a single doctor, Boyd, happened to be more alert than his predecessors. If Boyd had not tested the vomit, Herman would almost certainly have died, and Martha would have gone on to marry Otto and perhaps to kill again. Martha Needle was, in the end, both victim and perpetrator. She was a woman who suffered terribly, and a woman who inflicted terrible suffering. She was failed by every institution that might have helped her. Her family, the law, the medical profession, the church, and she responded by becoming the thing that had been done to her, a force of destruction operating behind a mask of care. There is a barbershop now at 137 Bridge Road, Richmond, where Louis Juncken once ran his saddlery and where Martha Needle once served cups of poisoned tea. The grave at Borundera General Cemetery in Kew, the elaborate monument Martha built for her family, has been vandalized. And today there is no evidence of the headstone she paid for with the insurance money she collected on their deaths. Martha's own body lies at the former Pentridge prison site, reinterred after the old Melbourne Gaol graves were dug up in 1929. Her death mask is on display at the old Melbourne Gaol Museum, and her headstone, the crude bluestone block carved MN 221094, lies beneath the sand at Brighton Beach, facing the waters of Port Phillip Bay. The poison is gone, the tea is long since cold, the victims are dust, but the stone remains and the story remains, and the questions remain about poverty and violence, about madness and motherhood, about the terrible ease with which the domestic sphere could become a killing ground in an age when no one thought to look. Martha Needle reminds us that the most dangerous people are not always the ones with weapons in their hands. Sometimes they are the ones who smile, take your coat, and offer you a cup of tea. In a few hours I shall be free from all sorrow, she wrote to Otto on the morning of her death. When you receive this, you can think of me as being in a happy home. She was hanged at 8 o'clock. The bolt was drawn, the platform fell, and the widow of Richmond went home.